Hi, this is Mark from eReplacementParts.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove and replace the spindle in a drill press. The spindle is the part of the drill press that actually rotates the chuck. It's located inside the quill, which is this piece here. The spindle can become bent if the drill press is overloaded. Also, there's two bearings that connect the quill to the spindle. If those bearings fail, you'll need to remove the spindle to replace them. And we're going to show you how to do that. Okay, let's get started. First, we'll remove the drill chuck. For more information about how to do this, check out our video about how to remove a drill press chuck. Next, we'll remove the belt. Now we're on the side of the press where the quill spring is located. Next to that, there's a small screw. This screw is what keeps the quill from moving side to side in the press. We need to remove that next. Take off the nut, and then the set screw will unthread. Now we can move on to the quill spring itself. This spring is under a lot of tension, so we have to be careful here. We're going to start by removing the outermost nut. There's two nuts here because the two nuts together keep the proper tension on that spring. So I remove the outermost nut first. I want to be careful not to unthread this inner nut while I do this. Okay, now we can move on to that inner nut. I want to back it off, but not all the way. You'll notice on the press right here, there's a little lip, and that lip fits onto a notch. These two together are what are holding the tension on that spring. You'll also notice there's a piece of the spring that extends out from this housing. When the tension comes off of this, if my hands were around that, this piece can cut me quite badly. So what I'm going to do is with that nut backed off, I'm going to take a screwdriver and just pry the housing away from the press and let the spring release on its own. Like that. Now I'll go ahead and remove the assembly. At this point, the only thing holding the quill and spindle assembly into the drill press are the gears between the quill and the handles. So to remove the quill and spindle, I just simply need to pull the handle away from the press. And now the quill and spindle will slide right out. Now we can move on to removing the spindle from the quill. At this point, really the only thing holding the spindle to the quill is the friction of the bearings. Also, there's a retaining ring on top. We'll need to remove that. Now we can remove the spindle from the quill. Ideally, you would do this with a bearing press, but I doubt many of you have a bearing press at home. So I'm going to show you a way you can do it with a vise. I've adjusted the opening on my vise so that it's open far enough that it'll rest on the edge of the quill without interfering with the bearing. Now I can set the quill on the jaws of the vise and tap on the end of the spindle until it comes free of the bearings. Like that. Now we'll remove this bearing from the spindle. I want to adjust my vise down again so that it's grabbing just that inner race on the bearing. I don't want to be touching the spindle, but I do want the jaws to be touching the inner race. And now I can tap the spindle free from the bearing. Now we'll install the new spindle into our press. We'll start by installing the bearing back onto the spindle. Now I'll go ahead and insert the spindle back into the quill and seat those bearings. I seat this lower quill bearing first, and as I did that, it'll usually move the upper one out of the quill a little bit. So just to be sure that's seated correctly, I'll close my vise up a little bit and tap a bit more, and that'll set that lower bearing. Now I can go ahead and replace the retaining ring. And just make sure that it sets in its little groove. Now the quill assembly goes back into the press. And I remount the handle assembly. Now we'll go ahead and replace the return spring assembly. You'll notice I put on a pair of gloves for this part. It's because when we go to retension this spring, there is danger of getting cut by that piece of the spring that's exposed that I mentioned earlier. So I've just mounted the spring back onto the press. It's not under tension right now. I'm going to take one of the two nuts that hold that spring and thread it into place. But again, leave it loose so I still have room to move the spring back and forth against the drill press body. Now I'm ready to tension the spring. I'll turn the spring counterclockwise about one full turn. Remember that there's the little notches on the spring housing that fit against the tab on the drill press body. So when I spin it one turn, then I'll just index one of the tabs onto that notch. That should be the correct tension. And then I press the housing onto that notch, or the tab, on the drill press body, and tighten up that outer nut. Now I just need to adjust this nut, basically to clamp the spring assembly against the press housing. I don't want this too tight, and the way I can tell that it is too tight is when I adjust the spindle up and down, or the quill up and down, you can feel a little bit of rubbing in the drill press. I want it to just touch. I don't want too much rubbing because that will promote wear. If I get it too loose, I run the risk of this housing popping away from the drill press body and I'll lose tension on the spring again. So it just takes a little fiddling with it to get everything just right, and I think that's good. Now I can replace the second nut. And to tighten up that second nut, I'm going to take a pair of needle nose pliers and hold the first nut to keep it from rotating, and then use a wrench to tighten down the second nut. Like that. Now we'll reinstall the set screw that keeps the quill from being able to move side to side. You'll notice on the set screw that there's a couple of flat spots on either side of it. And those flat spots are the same direction as the slit in the screw for the screwdriver. So as I reinstall this, I want to make sure that when I have the tension set where I think it should be, that the slit in the end of the screw is vertical when I'm done. That'll keep those flat spots vertical on the slit in the quill. That ought to work. Now I can reinstall the nut. I'll put the screwdriver through the center of the nut to keep the set screw from spinning as I tighten up the nut. Just like that. The last two steps are to reinstall the belt and the chuck. I'll start with the belt. Now we'll go ahead and replace the chuck. The chuck just slides onto a taper, so I just give it a sharp snap onto the press, and then using my shop hammer, not the metal ends, but the plastic side, strike the chuck to set it onto that taper. Like that. As you can see, replacing the spindle on your drill press is definitely a repair you can do on your own. If you found this video helpful, please feel free to leave a comment or ask a question.